Hello, everyone. Welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight, we bring you 5 of the most disturbing true accounts from the Appalachian Trail and the ancient mountains that surround it. The Appalachian Trail stretches over 2,000 miles through some of the oldest, most unforgiving terrain in North America. Millions know it as a test of endurance, a pilgrimage through wilderness. But those who've walked its remote stretches know something else lives in those hollows and ridges, something that doesn't want to be found and doesn't let go of those who stumble into its domain. The stories you're about to hear come from hikers, hunters, and locals who encountered things on that trail that can't be explained by maps or reason. These are their words, exactly as they told them to us. If you've ever considered a solo hike through Appalachia, you might want to listen carefully to what they have to say.
This happened in October of 2019 when I was 31. My name's Daniel, I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and I'd been planning a solo through hike of a southern section of the Appalachian Trail for about 6 months. I'm an experienced backpacker. I'd done parts of the Pacific Crest Trail, sections of the Continental Divide. So when people warned me about hiking alone through the Smokies in late fall, I didn't take it too seriously. I'd heard the usual cautions. Weather turns fast, shelters fill up, black bears, water sources, standard stuff. What nobody mentioned, what I wish someone had told me, was to pay attention when the trail goes quiet. I started my section hike at Newfound Gap, planning to cover about 70 miles over 5 days, ending near Hot Springs, North Carolina. The first 2 days were perfect. Cold, clear skies, the kind of hiking where every step feels earned. I passed other hikers during the day, saw a couple of deer, refilled my water at streams that ran so clean you could see every stone on the bottom. By the third night, I'd made it to a shelter near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, a 3-sided wooden structure set back about 50 yards from the trail. The shelter log showed the last entry was from 4 days prior. I had the place to myself. I got there maybe an hour before sunset, set up my sleeping bag on the wooden platform, filtered some water, ate my freeze-dried dinner while watching the light fade through the trees. The forest had that deep autumn smell, leaf rot and cold earth. I remember feeling good, accomplished, the kind of tired that means you've pushed yourself the right amount. I was in my bag by 7:30, reading by headlamp, planning to get an early start the next morning. That's when I first heard it. A voice, distant but distinct, calling out somewhere in the woods to the east. It sounded like someone shouting a name, maybe hello or help. I couldn't make it out exactly. I turned off my headlamp and listened. The voice came again, definitely a man, definitely distressed. My first thought was that another hiker was lost or injured. Cell service was non-existent where I was, and the nearest ranger station was probably 10 miles back. I grabbed my headlamp and my phone, pulled on my boots, and called out in the direction of the voice. "Hey, you okay? Where are you?" Silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then the voice again, a little closer this time, still calling out. It didn't sound like it was responding to me, just calling. I stepped away from the shelter, following the sound maybe 20 yards into the tree line. The forest was dense there, rhododendron thickets and mountain laurel making it hard to see more than a few feet, even with my light. "I'm here," I shouted. "Keep making noise, I'll come to you." The voice called again. This time I realized something that made my skin go cold. It sounded closer, but it was coming from a different direction. Not east anymore, but northeast, maybe 45 degrees off from where I'd first heard it. I stopped walking. In all my years hiking, I'd never heard an echo behave like that. The topography wasn't right for it. I stood there in the dark, surrounded by trees, and called out one more time. "Where are you?" The voice answered immediately. Same tone, same volume, but now it was behind me. West. Back toward the shelter, but deeper in the woods. And the thing that made me start backing toward the trail, the thing I still can't explain, is that I realized it wasn't saying words anymore. It was just making the shape of calling out, the rhythm and pitch of someone yelling for help, but there was no actual language in it. Just sound. I got back to the shelter and I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the wooden platform with my knife in one hand and my headlamp in the other, listening. The voice called out every 20 minutes or so until about 2 in the morning, each time from a different direction, each time a little closer. Never close enough to see, but close enough that I knew if I went looking again, I'd find something, and I knew I didn't want to find it. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, I packed up faster than I ever have and got back on the trail. I told myself it was someone messing with me, maybe locals who knew about the shelter and liked scaring hikers, but I've lived in enough wild places to know what a human voice sounds like in the woods, and I've never heard a human voice move like that. I finished my hike 2 days later, barely stopping, barely sleeping, and I haven't been back to that section of trail since. About a year later, I was reading through some forums about the Appalachian Trail, just out of curiosity, and I found 3 other accounts, different years, different hikers, describing the same thing in that same general area. A voice in the woods that moves, that calls but doesn't answer. One of them said they followed it and found a hollow log with dozens of names carved inside. Some of the carvings so old they were barely legible, they didn't stay to read them all. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was trying to lead me somewhere or just playing with me. But I know that if you're hiking that section of trail and you hear someone calling for help after dark, don't go looking. Whatever it is, it's not lost. It knows exactly where it is, and it knows exactly what it's doing.
Our next story comes from a woman who learned that some shelters on the trail aren't marked on any map, and the people who use them aren't hikers.
This happened back in April of 2016. I'm Sarah, I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and I'd just finished graduate school and decided to treat myself to a solo hike before starting my first real job. I chose a section of the AT through Southwest Virginia near Grayson Highlands because I'd heard it was beautiful and relatively well-traveled. I wasn't an expert backpacker, but I'd done enough camping to feel confident. My plan was 4 days, 3 nights, staying at the marked shelters along the way. The first night went fine. I stayed at a shelter with 2 other hikers, a couple from Pennsylvania doing a week-long trip. We shared trail food, talked about our routes, and I felt safe. They were heading south the next morning while I was going north, so I said goodbye and set out alone around sunrise. The weather was perfect, mid-60s, partly cloudy, that green smell that comes with spring in the mountains. I made good time, stopped for lunch by a creek, and by late afternoon I was looking for the shelter I'd marked on my map, a place called Thomas Knob Shelter. According to my map and GPS, I should have reached it by 5 o'clock. By 6, I still hadn't seen it. The trail markers were there, white blazes on the trees every 100 feet or so, but no sign pointing to the shelter. I started to worry I'd missed a turn. Cell service was dead, and the sun was getting lower. I kept walking, figuring I'd either find the shelter or I'd have to set up my tent on flat ground somewhere. That's when I saw the shelter that wasn't on my map. It was set back from the trail, maybe 30 yards, partially hidden by a stand of pine trees. It looked like the other AT shelters I'd seen. 3 wooden walls, a slanted roof, an open front facing the trail. But something about it felt wrong immediately. The wood was darker, older, and there was no sign indicating its name or distance to the next shelter. More than that, it was too quiet around it. The birds I'd been hearing all day were gone. Even the wind seemed to stop when I got close. I should have kept walking. Every instinct I had told me to keep walking. But the light was fading fast, and I was tired, and the idea of setting up my tent alone in the dark wasn't appealing. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that it was just an older shelter that hadn't been updated on the maps yet. I approached slowly, calling out to see if anyone was already there. But there was no answer. The inside was empty. No gear, no trash, no shelter log. Which was strange because every AT shelter I'd ever seen had a logbook for hikers to sign. The wooden sleeping platform was bare and covered in a thin layer of dust and pine needles, like it hadn't been used in months. There were some weird scratches on the back wall, deep gouges in the wood that didn't look like animal claws. They were too deliberate, almost like tally marks, but there were hundreds of them, clustered in groups. I set my pack down and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I told myself I'd stay the night, get up early, and find the actual Thomas Knob shelter in the morning. I set up my sleeping bag, ate a cold dinner because I didn't want to bother with my stove, and tried to relax. By 8 o'clock, it was fully dark, and I was inside my sleeping bag with my headlamp, reading and trying not to think about how isolated I felt. That's when I heard the footsteps. Someone was walking toward the shelter from deeper in the woods, not from the trail. I could hear branches snapping, the crunch of leaves, a slow and deliberate pace. My first thought was relief. Another hiker, maybe someone local who used this shelter regularly. I sat up and called out, "Hello?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart starting to beat faster. Is someone there? Nothing. Complete silence. Then, after maybe 10 seconds, the footsteps started again. Same pace, same direction. Closer now. I grabbed my headlamp and shined it out into the darkness beyond the shelter's opening. The beam didn't reach far, maybe 20 feet before it dissolved into the trees, but I could see movement. Not a person walking upright, but something low to the ground, moving between the trees, circling the shelter. I turned off my headlamp. I don't know why I did that. Maybe some primal instinct told me not to let it know exactly where I was. I sat in the dark, barely breathing, listening to whatever it was move around the perimeter of the shelter. It circled 3 times, and each time it got closer. On the 3rd pass, it stopped directly in front of the opening. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it breathing. Deep, wet breaths, like something was struggling to pull air through damaged lungs. And then I heard something else. A low clicking sound, rhythmic, like someone or something was tapping their teeth together. Click, click, click. Click, 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 over and over. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I sat there in my sleeping bag in the pitch dark, gripping my knife, praying that whatever it was would lose interest and leave. The clicking went on for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes. Then it stopped. The breathing stopped, and I heard it move away, back into the woods, the footsteps fading until there was nothing but the wind in the trees. I didn't sleep. I sat there with my knife in one hand until the first gray light of dawn started to filter through the trees. The moment I could see well enough to pack, I stuffed everything into my bag and got the hell out of there. I didn't look back at the shelter. I didn't check to see if there were tracks in the dirt. I just walked as fast as I could until I found the real trail again. I found Thomas Knob Shelter about 2 miles north. It was right where it should have been on my map, full of hikers making breakfast. Completely normal. I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't tell anyone for a long time because I knew how it would sound. But a few months later, I found a forum post from another hiker who'd stayed at an unmarked shelter in that same area. They described the scratches on the wall and the sound of something circling in the dark. They said they'd reported it to a local ranger, and the ranger had told them there used to be old shelters built by logging companies back in the 20s and 30s, before the trail was established, and that some of them were still standing in the deep woods. He also said that people who stayed in them sometimes didn't make it back to the trail. I don't know what was outside that shelter. I don't know if it was an animal or a person or something worse. But I know that if you're hiking the AT and you come across a shelter that isn't on your map, keep walking. Don't trust it. Don't stay the night. Because whatever uses those places, it isn't hikers.
The next account comes from a trail maintainer who spent years working in some of the most remote sections of the Appalachian corridor, until he found something that made him quit.
My name's Robert, but everyone calls me Rob. I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, and I worked as a volunteer trail maintainer for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for 8 years, from 2010 to 2018. If you don't know what that means, it's basically this. I'd go out with a small crew or sometimes alone, and we'd clear blowdowns, maintain blazes, repair water bars, that kind of thing. It's hard work, but I loved it. I loved being out there in the wilderness, taking care of something bigger than myself. I loved knowing that the work I did would help thousands of hikers every year. I quit in the summer of 2018 because of what I found near Max Patch, up on the border between North Carolina and Tennessee. It was late July, and I'd been assigned a solo maintenance run on a 12-mile stretch that didn't see a lot of traffic. This was advanced stuff: steep terrain, thick brush, sections where the trail hadn't been cleared in months. I'd done this route before, so I wasn't worried. I packed in enough supplies for 3 days, planning to camp rough and work my way south to a pickup point near a forest road. The first day was normal. I cleared a couple of big blowdowns, repainted some faded blazes, checked the drainage on a few steep sections. By evening, I'd covered maybe 5 miles and set up my tent near a small clearing about 100 yards off the trail. I made dinner, watched the sun set over the ridgeline, and went to sleep feeling good about the work. The second day is when things started to feel off. I was working my way along a particularly overgrown section, using my machete to clear back rhododendron and laurel that had encroached on the trail, when I found the first marker. It wasn't an official blaze. It was a piece of red cloth tied to a tree branch about 6 feet off the ground. Bright red, synthetic material. Definitely not something that had been there long. I figured it was from a hiker who'd gotten off trail and marked their way back, but it was strange because it wasn't on the trail. It was about 10 feet into the woods, pointing away from the path. I ignored it and kept working. An hour later, I found another one. Same red cloth, same height, deeper into the woods. Then another and another. They formed a line heading northeast, off the trail and up the slope toward a heavily wooded ridge. I followed them. I know I shouldn't have. I know my job was to maintain the trail, not explore random markers in the woods. But something about them bothered me. They were too deliberate, too evenly spaced. And the further I followed them, the more I realized they were leading somewhere specific. After about half a mile of scrambling uphill through dense forest, I found what they were leading to. It was a camp, but not like any camp I'd ever seen. There were 4 or 5 old canvas tents set up in a rough circle, all of them sagging and rotted, covered in moss and mildew. In the center of the circle was a fire pit, and around the fire pit were logs arranged like benches. The whole thing looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, but the red markers leading to it were fresh. That didn't make sense. I walked into the circle slowly, my hand on the can of bear spray on my belt. The tents were empty, just old sleeping bags and rusted cooking equipment inside. But there was something else. Photographs, dozens of them, tacked to the trees around the camp, all facing inward toward the fire pit. They were old Polaroids, faded and water-damaged, showing people, men, women, kids, standing in the woods. Normal camping photos, except that in every single one, there was something wrong with the faces. They were blurred or scratched out or obscured by weird, dark smudges that looked like they'd been added after the photo was developed. I felt my stomach turn. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but I had no service, and the battery was draining faster than it should have been. I took a few shots anyway, then decided I needed to get out of there and report this to a ranger. This felt like something bigger than trail maintenance. This felt like something dangerous. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. I spun around, and there was a man standing at the edge of the camp. He was tall, maybe in his 50s, wearing old hunting clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. His face was weathered and hard, and he was holding a rifle, not pointed at me but held casually across his chest. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, then looked at the camp, then back at me. "You're not supposed to be here," he finally said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "I'm a trail maintainer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I saw the markers and followed them. I didn't mean to intrude." "You need to leave," he said, "right now." I nodded and started backing away, keeping my eyes on him. He didn't move, just watched me go. When I'd gotten maybe 20 yards, he called out, "Don't tell anyone about this place. Don't come back. And don't follow red markers." I didn't stop moving until I was back on the trail, and even then I didn't slow down. I packed up my camp that night and hiked out a day early, telling my supervisor I'd finished the work faster than expected. I didn't mention the camp. I didn't mention the man with the rifle. I told myself I'd forget about it, that it was just some weird off-grid guy living in the woods and I'd stumbled into his space. But a few weeks later, I was talking to another maintainer, a guy who'd worked the AT for 20 years, and I casually asked him if he'd ever seen red cloth markers off-trail. His face went pale. He told me he'd seen them once, years ago, in a different section of the trail in Virginia. He'd followed them too, and he'd found a similar camp. He said he'd reported it to the Forest Service, and they'd told him to stay away from it, that it was under investigation. But nothing ever came of it. No arrests, no news stories, nothing. He told me that there are people in the deep Appalachian woods who don't want to be found, people who've been living out there for generations, and some of them have rituals, practices. He wouldn't say more than that, but he told me that if I ever saw red markers again, I should turn around immediately. I never saw them again, but I also never went back to that section of trail. I quit volunteer work the next year and moved to a different part of the state. I still hike, but I don't go alone anymore, and I don't go off-trail. Because I know now that there are places in those mountains where people like me aren't welcome. Places that have their own rules, their own inhabitants, and their own way of dealing with outsiders who get too curious. If you're hiking the AT and you see markers that aren't official blazes, don't follow them. Stay on the trail. And if someone tells you to leave, don't ask questions. Just go.
This next testimony comes from a forestry student who spent a semester studying wildlife patterns in the Appalachian Highlands until her cameras captured something that shouldn't exist.
This happened in the fall semester of 2017. My name's Emily. I'm from Pittsburgh, and at the time I was a graduate student in forestry at Virginia Tech. My thesis project involved setting up trail cameras in a remote section of the Jefferson National Forest near the West Virginia border to study black bear behavior and migration patterns. I'd done similar fieldwork before, so I wasn't nervous about spending time alone in the woods. I'd set up a dozen cameras along game trails and near-known bear feeding sites, and my plan was to check them every 2 weeks, swap out memory cards, change batteries, that kind of thing. The area I was working in was incredibly remote. No cell service, no hiking trails, just old logging roads and dense forest. The nearest town was a tiny place called Paint Bank, about an hour's drive away. I'd camp at a Forest Service cabin during my check-ins, and I'd usually spend 2 or 3 days hiking the circuit of all my camera sites. It was hard work, but I loved it. Being alone out there, watching the seasons change, seeing the data come in, it felt important. The first few check-ins were normal. I was getting good footage of bears, deer, coyotes, even a bobcat once. Everything was going according to plan. But on my 4th check-in in mid-October, I started noticing something strange. 3 of my cameras, all in different locations but all on the western side of my study area, were triggering constantly.
When I reviewed the footage, most of it was just branches moving in the wind or shadows from passing clouds, false triggers. But buried in the hundreds of clips, there was something else. A figure. It appeared in the background of the shots, always at a distance, always blurry. At first I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone who didn't realize they were in a research area. But the more I looked at the footage, the less sense that made. The figure was tall, maybe 7 feet, and it moved in a way that wasn't quite right. Not jerky or obviously inhuman, just off. Like it was walking but the rhythm was wrong, or the joints bent at slightly incorrect angles. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the camera, a compression artifact or a weird shadow. But the figure appeared in footage from all 3 cameras over the course of a week, always at dusk or dawn, always moving through the background, never approaching the camera directly. And in one clip, from the camera positioned highest on the ridge, I could see it standing completely still behind a tree, facing the camera. It stayed there for almost 3 minutes before the camera's recording cycle ended. I flagged the footage and brought it back to my advisor, thinking maybe it was something worth documenting, a very tall hiker or someone living rough in the woods. He looked at the clips, frowned, and told me to move those 3 cameras to different locations. He didn't say why. He just said it would be better for the integrity of the study. I should have listened to him. Instead, I went back out 2 weeks later and checked the cameras in their original positions, ignoring his advice. I wanted to know what I was seeing. This time, the footage was worse. The figure was closer, much closer. In one clip, it was standing maybe 15 feet from the camera, partially obscured by underbrush, facing directly toward the lens. The motion sensor had triggered, but the figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, in the middle of the night, completely still. I could see the outline of its body, broad shoulders, long arms, something wrong with the proportions, but I couldn't make out any facial features. The image was too dark, too grainy. But the worst part was what happened next in the footage. After about 30 seconds of standing still, the figure moved. Not walked, moved. It covered the distance from where it was standing to the tree the camera was mounted on in less than a second. One frame it was 15 feet away, the next frame it was directly in front of the lens, so close that the camera's infrared flash whited out the image. And then, for just a single frame, I could see what looked like a face. Pale, hollow, wrong. The camera shut off after that. When I checked it in person, the battery was completely dead, even though I'd just replaced it 2 weeks earlier. The memory card was corrupted, but I'd already pulled the footage off the cloud backup. I showed the clip to my advisor again. This time, he didn't tell me to move the cameras. He told me to pull them entirely, to abandon that section of my study area. He said that Forest Service rangers had reported unusual activity in that part of Jefferson National Forest for years, and that students had been discouraged from working there. He said he'd approved my site selection because I hadn't proposed putting cameras in the specific area where problems had been reported, but it seemed like I'd gotten close enough. I asked him what kind of unusual activity. He wouldn't give me details. He just said that people had gone missing near there and that the official explanation was always exposure or falls, but that the rangers didn't believe it. He said there were things in the old Appalachian forests that didn't fit into any category we had names for, and that the smartest thing I could do was stay away. I pulled my cameras the next week and relocated my entire study area. I never went back to that section of the forest. I finished my thesis using data from the news sites, and I graduated the next spring. But I kept the footage. I've watched it maybe 100 times trying to understand what I captured. I've showed it to colleagues, to friends, to people online. Some think it's a hoax. Some think it's a person in a costume. A few think it's something else, a Sasquatch, a cryptid, an interdimensional being, whatever. I don't know what it was. But I know that it was aware of the cameras. I know that it approached them deliberately, and I know that whatever it was, it didn't want to be studied. The Appalachian Mountains are old, older than most people realize, and I think there are things living in those ridges and hollows that were there long before we were. things that don't want us getting too close. If you're a researcher or a hiker and you feel like you're being watched, trust that feeling. Set up a camera if you want, but don't be surprised if what you capture doesn't make sense. And if you see something tall and wrong moving through the trees at dawn or dusk, don't try to follow it. Don't try to prove it's real. Just leave and don't go back. Because some things don't want to be found, and they have ways of making sure they aren't.
Our final story tonight comes from a long-distance hiker who made the mistake of accepting help from a stranger on a rainy night near the Virginia-West Virginia border.
This happened 3 years ago, in September of 2022. My name's Marcus, I'm from Baltimore, and I was attempting a southbound through hike of the entire Appalachian Trail. I'd started at Katahdin in Maine back in June, and by September, I was in Virginia, closing in on 1,500 miles. I was exhausted but determined. I'd been averaging about 20 miles a day, and I'd gotten into a rhythm. Wake up at dawn, hike until evening, set up camp, sleep, repeat. On the day this happened, I was somewhere near Parisburg, Virginia, hiking through a section that parallels the New River. The weather had been threatening rain all day, and by late afternoon it started coming down hard. Not a gentle rain, a full-on storm, lightning and thunder, the kind where you can't see 10 feet in front of you. I was soaked within minutes, and the trail turned into a mud slick. I knew I needed to find shelter fast, either a trail shelter or a dry spot to set up my tent. I checked my trail guide and saw that the next shelter was about 4 miles ahead, which might as well have been 40 in those conditions. I was starting to worry about hypothermia when I saw lights through the trees. It was a house set back from the trail maybe 100 yards, with a gravel driveway leading down to a rural road. I could see smoke coming from the chimney and lights on in the windows. It looked warm, dry, and safe. I know what through hikers are supposed to do in that situation. Keep walking. Make it to the shelter. Don't bother locals. But I was cold and wet and tired, and I thought maybe someone would let me wait out the storm on their porch. I left the trail and walked down the driveway. The house was old, probably built in the 50s, white paint peeling off the wood siding. There was a pickup truck parked out front and a couple of rusted-out lawn chairs on the porch. I knocked on the door, and after a minute, a man answered. He was in his 60s, gray beard, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He looked at me, looked at my soaked gear, and smiled. "You hiking the trail?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if I could wait out the storm on your porch. I'll be out of your way as soon as it stops." He looked at the rain, then back at me. "Hell, come on inside. No sense standing out there in this mess. I'll make some coffee." I should have said no. I should have thanked him and stayed on the porch. But I was freezing, and the idea of coffee and warmth was too good to pass up. I followed him inside. The house was warm, heated by a wood stove in the corner of the living room. It was cluttered but not dirty. Newspapers stacked on the coffee table, hunting magazines, a couple of rifles mounted on the wall. He gestured for me to sit on the couch and went into the kitchen. I took off my pack and sat down, grateful to be out of the rain. He came back a few minutes later with 2 mugs of coffee. We talked for a while about the trail, about where I'd been and where I was going. He seemed friendly, interested, normal. He told me he'd lived in that house for 30 years, that he'd raised his kids there before they moved away. He asked if I wanted to stay the night. He had a guest room, he said, and the storm wasn't supposed to let up until morning. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say yes, but part of me felt uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me, a little too intent. Maybe it was how isolated the house felt, even though we weren't far from the trail. I told him I appreciated the offer, but that I needed to make miles, that I'd head out as soon as the rain slowed. He nodded, but I saw something change in his expression. Just for a second, something hard and cold. Then he smiled again. "Suit yourself," he said. The rain started to let up around 7 o'clock. I thanked him for the coffee and headed back out into the wet evening. By the time I got back to the trail, it was nearly dark. I hiked another mile, found a flat spot to set up my tent, and crashed for the night. The next morning, I packed up and kept moving south. About 10 miles later, I stopped at a trail shelter for lunch, and there were 3 other hikers there taking a break. We got to talking, and I mentioned the house where I'd waited out the storm. One of the hikers, a guy from North Carolina who'd been on the trail for months, went quiet. "What house?" he asked. I described it: white paint, gravel driveway, about 100 yards off the trail near Parisburg. His face went pale. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through some photos, and showed me an article. It was from a local news site, dated about 5 years earlier. The headline was something like, "Missing Hikers Case Reopened." The article talked about 2 thru hikers who'd disappeared in that area back in 2015, both last seen near a house matching the description I'd given. The owner of the house had been questioned by police but never charged. They'd searched the property and hadn't found anything. The case went cold. The hiker told me that there were rumors among the long-distance hiking community about that area, about a man who'd invite hikers in during bad weather, and some of them wouldn't be seen again. He said most hikers avoided going near houses at all in that section. He asked me if the man had offered to let me stay the night. I told him yes. He shook his head. "You got lucky, man. People who stay don't leave." I didn't want to believe him. I wanted to think he was just repeating trail gossip, urban legends that get passed around among hikers. But I couldn't shake the feeling I'd had in that house, the way the man's expression had changed when I said I was leaving. I thought about the rifles on the wall, the isolation of the property, how easy it would have been for him to make sure I never made it back to the trail. I finished my thru hike 6 weeks later, made it all the way to Springer Mountain in Georgia. But I've never forgotten that night, and I've never stopped wondering what would have happened if I'd said yes to staying over. A few months after I finished, I tried to find that house again using satellite imagery, but I couldn't locate it. The trail goes through so many remote areas, and without an exact address, it was like looking for a ghost. I don't know if that man was responsible for those missing hikers. I don't know if he was just a lonely guy trying to be helpful or something much worse. But I know that I felt something off in that house, and I know that I made the right choice by leaving when I did. The Appalachian Trail is full of kind people who will help hikers without asking for anything in return, but it's also full of people who see hikers as vulnerable, isolated, and easy targets. If you're hiking the trail and someone invites you into their home, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let the promise of warmth or food or shelter override that little voice in your head telling you to walk away. Because out there on those mountains, miles from help, that voice might be the only thing keeping you alive.
The Appalachian Trail has been called America's greatest footpath, a place of beauty and challenge and self-discovery. But the mountains it passes through are ancient and unforgiving, and they hold secrets that go deeper than any trail map can show. The 5 people who share their stories tonight all made it out, but not everyone does. Every year, hikers disappear on the AT. Some get lost, some fall, some simply vanish without explanation. The Park Service does their best. Search and rescue teams do their best. But there are places in those hollows and ridges where no one can help you. Places where the old rules still apply, where things that predate the trail, predate the maps, predate the settlements, still move through the darkness. If you're planning to hike the Appalachian Trail, respect it. Respect the distance, respect the wilderness, and respect the warnings from those who walked it before you. Don't follow voices in the dark. Don't trust shelters that aren't on your map. Don't follow markers that lead away from the path. And if something deep in your gut tells you to keep moving, to not accept that offered help, to not investigate that strange sound, listen to it. The mountains have been there for millions of years, and they'll be there long after we're gone. We're just passing through, and some of us don't even make it all the way. Thank you for listening to Blacktop Files. If you have your own story from the Appalachian Trail or any isolated road or forgotten place, we want to hear it. And if you found these accounts unsettling, consider sharing this video with someone brave enough to listen. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, not everything that watches you from the tree line is wildlife.